What's up, guys? This is a response to Jimmy at Bright Insight's new video where he goes into these old maps of Africa that show some really interesting things, like a forest the size of Texas right where the Sahara is, a major river running to the east, all the way up the Nile, and draw your attention to these three lakes here we'll talk about later. All of these maps show rivers and lakes all across Africa. These maps depicting a green Africa date from the early 1500s all the way into the 1600s. And what I'm going to propose may sound a little crazy at first, but it's actually grounded in solid research. So if this does happen to get to Jimmy and you decide to use this, I would appreciate if you shout out Static in the Attic because I'm buried by the YouTube algorithm. First, I want to point out Lake Chad that has diminished greatly just in our lifetimes, but at its greatest extent, it was 154,000 square miles. So large they refer to this as an inland sea, and they date this to the Precambrian period, 4.6 billion years ago. This is a modern map, and the red pin is the location of Lake Chad. You can obviously see that this cartographer's version from the early 1500s has a bit of a distortion, but right in that same general area, you see Lacus Libya next to a forest that at this scale would be about the size of Texas, as Jimmy pointed out. Today, if you've got the coin, you can be flown in by private helicopter, and you can leave the machete at home. Instead of trudging through tropical rainforest, you'll be wading through desert sands. Other maps of the time show the exact same Lake Libya, and if these are even remotely close to scale, then we're talking a body of water that is hundreds of miles long. The same can be done with many of the rivers depicted on the maps, where Wiki has the Tamanrasset River at 5,000 years ago. SciNews says 100,000 years ago there were three major rivers, creating what they call green corridors. At least one river system is estimated to be 100 kilometers wide. It was even habitated by perennial plants. I want to point out first, all of the green dots are known archaeological sites, and they depict numerous rivers, one of which being 50 miles wide. For point of reference, let's use this cove right here. Modern day, you can see this area is dry as a bone. Yet the maps from 15 and 1600s show rivers all across the north coast of Africa. So it's not even a point of conjecture whether or not these ancient lakes and rivers existed. We know this for a fact. So the only question is, when did they exist? Let's hear from Jimmy.
Now let me first say that I am not suggesting that these various 500 and 600-year-old maps are actually depicting the Sahara with lakes, rivers, and forests at that time, but rather that these maps are evidence of a lost ancient knowledge of what the Sahara was like between 5 and possibly even more than 10,000 years ago. And here's how you know.
Now, I agree that these maps were probably comprised of older source maps and weren't contemporary to 15 and 1600. Yet, jumping straight back to 5,000 years is a big leap for me. Let me explain my side. First off, why would all of the cartographers of the time be interested in depicting things from 5,000 years ago and none of them be interested in illustrating what is currently there, to the best of their knowledge, which I'll get to? I highly recommend everybody go watch the video. He did a great job, good video, and this isn't meant as a diss by any means. But he goes on to explain that modern scientists say that yes, the Sahara used to be green, and this was around 5,000 years ago. Therefore, these maps must be depicting things as they were from 5,000 years ago. Perhaps this is not an ancient line of cartographers that have passed down the knowledge of the landscape for thousands of years, and the fact of the matter is that modern scientists have the dates wrong on when there was a green Sahara. So from the Precambrian period, 4.6 billion years ago, to 5,000 years ago, to 100,000 years ago, tell me you're not sure about the dating without actually telling me you're not sure about the dating. Was the Green Sahara really 5,000 years ago or much sooner in time to us? Jimmy points out this map that depicts Mansa Musa, who is known as the richest man in the history of the world. Musa hails from the East African coast of the Mali Empire. He lived in the 14th century, pretty close to the time of the travels of Marco Polo and the much less known Ibn Battuta. Jimmy points out on the map of Mansa Musa, there are cities all across the desert. Now, if this is a map depicting the landscape of 5,000 years ago, why would you have Mansa Musa from the 14th century on there? That would be like placing Marco Polo next to the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. It just doesn't make sense. We also know that Musa went on Hajj, which is Islamic pilgrimage, from the east coast of Africa all the way to Mecca, and gave out so much gold that he broke local economies in Egypt and Arabia. You guys want to guess what route he took in the 1300s? Straight across the interior of the continent, where today, if you got money for a helicopter, you might want to visit. Briefly. Now, this is the richest guy in the history of the world. He could have traveled however he wanted to travel, and that was the route he took, straight across the interior of the continent. And this map shows him along with all of these cities, leading me to believe those cities were inhabited at the time of Mansa Musa. Do you think Elon Musk would travel through here on his way to Egypt? Probably not, unless conditions were much different. Now, I'm not going to argue that we had a green Africa when these maps were made, but I will speculate that these are compiled from source maps from just prior to this period of time, and that even as late as the time of Mansa Musa, conditions could have been much different in Africa. Now, my viewers will not be shocked by any of this, but if this is the first time you've ever heard of this and this does reach new people, take the time to hear me out here, please. This period of time I'm referring to is what mainstream history tells us was the Black Death, and that between 75 and 200 million people perished. That is a majority of the population at the time. But what if I told you there's much more to this story that has been hidden from us? First off, let me list the source of this rare knowledge. The following is from the Black D and Dancing Mania book by Dr. J.F.C. Hecker, transcribed into English in 1888. Dr. Hecker is a well-respected and distinguished professor of medicine and someone I would consider a respected source for this information. I'm going to dive straight into the deep end and then we'll paddle back from there. The signs of terrestrial commotions commenced in Europe in the year 1348, same year as the Black D, after districts in Asia had been visited in the same manner. On the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean just north of Africa, the plague from the east had already broken out when an earthquake shook the foundations of the island and was accompanied by so frightful a hurricane that the inhabitants had slain their slaves in order that they might not themselves be subjugated by them, and fled in dismay. The sea overflowed, the ships were dashed to pieces on the rocks, and few outlived the terrific event whereby this fertile and blooming island was converted into a desert. I really don't know how much more straightforward you could be in saying that today's desert dry landscape of Cyprus was lush and tropical all the way up until the 1300s. It really kind of makes you wonder about how old those cities are too, but I'll stay on point. This is the island of Cyprus that was lush and tropical up until the 1300s. Well, what about the rest of the area? After all, Jimmy does point out this Science News article saying that the largest freshwater lake on Earth was reduced to desert in just a few hundred years. I'd argue they're correct and that this happened around the 1300s. Again, why would they be spending all of this time and money on a landscape from 5,000 years ago? And no cartographers are making maps of the current conditions of their time. It makes more sense to me that they use maps from before what I'm about to tell you happened. There were a series of catastrophes in the 1300s that really devastated the world to the point they had to go back out and rediscover and remap the entire world. This is known as the Age of Exploration, starting in the 1400s, right after the catastrophes of the 1300s. I think they were using maps from before that event of what the world used to look like all the way up into the 1600s. These places were possibly inaccessible for a couple hundred years. Then they started updating the maps when they noticed features were different. From the 1600s on, and you can do this with every continent, they start saying a new map of that area. I know some people are going to say that there's no way that could have happened that recently. We know about it. Let me point out that a couple hundred years ago, Abraham Lincoln casually mentions that race of extinct giants that fill the mountains of America, and everybody in America knew what he was talking about. Yet today, this never happened. Let's go back to what JFC Hecker wrote. An inquiry into the causes of the Black D will not be without important results, although it cannot advance beyond generalization without entering upon a field hitherto uncultivated and to this hour entirely unknown. Mighty revolutions in the organism of Earth, of which we have credible information, had preceded it. So he just said flat out, SHTF happened prior to the Black D, and that it is entirely unknown to them in the 1800s and us today. From China to the Atlantic, the foundations of the earth were shaken. Throughout Asia and Europe, the atmosphere was in commotion and endangered, and by its baneful influence, both vegetable and animal life. This series of great events began in the year 1333, and I'll just let you guys look through what all happened there. 400,000 people carried away. The mountain Tinshu fell in. 5 million people. And then we get to the island of Cyprus, and he goes on. He says things occurred in Asia, in Egypt, in Syria, and says the sea overflowed, a seismic event, 10 days duration, inundations, and that all the water in France couldn't be attributed to the Rhine alone, for everywhere, even on tops of mountains, springs were seen to burst forth, and dry tracks were laid underwater in an inexplicable manner. Here we have a doctor that just wants to write a medical paper, and he says that you can't go into the Black D without acknowledging that this happened as well. And just happens to know that during major seismic events, water shoots up out of the ground just like it did in New Zealand in 2011. German accounts say expressly that a thick, stinking mist advanced from the east and spread itself over Italy. In thousands of places, chasms were formed from whence arose noxious vapors. This is exactly what happened in Syria a while back, only without the vapors, but look at the size of that thing. It was reported that a fiery meteor, which descended on the Earth far in the east, had destroyed everything within a circumference of more than 100 leagues, that is 300 miles, 600 kilometers, infecting the air far and wide. Now, we are told that events like that are almost non-existent. So to recap, I think these old maps, all the way through the 15 and 1600s, were still being based off of maps from the 1300s before there were drastic changes that happened. Like Hecker said, this is hitherto unknown information, but all the way up into the 1300s, the island of Cyprus was a lush tropical island, and after a hurricane and tsunami, it became a barren desert. I can show the effects of this on every culture around the world from 700 years ago. I think it was big enough to change climatological patterns here on Earth, and that this area could have still been quite habitable. For more information on these Earth change cycles, check out this playlist. Jimmy, if you or any other creators decide to pass this along in your videos, I would very much appreciate giving credit to Static in the Attic. I might have to start a part 2 because I'm invisible to new viewers. But for you guys that are here, thank you for stopping by. Like, subscribe, blah, blah. Catch you guys on the next one. Static out. So to recap,